Perfect, thank you. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 8th meeting of the Disaster Mobility Data Network. I think this one is actually an especially timely discussion given the ongoing events in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. And we will be looking forward to the discussion about this as we're able to open it up towards the end of the time here. The topic for this month is on disasters and displacement, and the role that mobility data of various kinds plays in understanding disasters and displacement. And we're really fortunate to be joined by 3 outstanding speakers on the topic. 2 from the United Nations Committee of Experts on Big Data for Official Statistics. Do I have that correct? One of these really long names, but coming from the International Telecommunications Union and the University of Tokyo as their home institutions, Esperanza Magpantai and Ayumi Arai. And Ayumi especially, thank you very much for making the time for joining from Japan. And then my colleague, Rebecca Moreno Jimenez from UNHCR, who will be able to speak to the outstanding work that UNHCR has been doing, understanding displacement, internal displacement, refugee flows, and the role that mobility data is increasingly playing in UNHCR's analytical approach to these topics. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Esperanza Magpantai. Oh, before I say that, I should just note that my name's Andrew Schroeder. I'm from Direct Relief and Crisis Ready, and we host these, for anyone who's new, we host the Disaster Mobility Data Network along with our colleagues at GFDRR every month. So we will be happy to be in touch with you in the future about all of this. Thank you very much, and take it away, Esperanza.
Thank you very much. So this afternoon, I'm going to share with you the work that we are doing in the UN Global Working Group on Big Data. We call it now UN Committee of Experts on Big Data and Data Science. So the work that Ayumi will present is part of this global initiative that looks at different data sources, including mobile phone data. So I'm going to provide some information on the task team that looks at the information that relates to mobile phone data, the different types of applications, then that will include the disaster that Ayumi will present, the handbooks, and anything that relates to the work that we focus in this group. So just to give you a context, so the UN Committee of Experts on Big Data and Data Science for Official Statistics is a UN-wide initiative which is composed of different UN organizations, both regional and international, as well as experts coming from countries, mainly coming from national statistical offices. It's also composed of an advisory board and several task teams that work on different areas of big data. One of them that I put an arrow here is on mobile phone data. And so the objective here is to come together and share experiences and develop methodologies and guidelines that will help countries to implement big data analysis and to complement the existing official statistics that they produce. So currently there are also regional hubs, and these regional hubs present in China, Africa, UAE, and Brazil are mainly the focal points where countries can come to and experiment on how they can use big data in the national context. So specifically on the task team on mobile phone data, which is currently composed of more than 50 individual experts representing countries, international and regional organizations, as well as think tanks and private institutions. This task team comes together once a month to discuss and share experiences that relate to the methodologies that will help improve the quality and availability of indicators that relates to the SDG monitoring. And so the idea here is, given that there's a lack of data in many countries, that we are able to use mobile phone data to supplement the missing information for those indicators. And so there's a number of activities that we do, including projects, events, and of course, the handbooks that will be presented to you later on. And so there are different types of applications where mobile phone data can be used. One of them is disaster management, as we will hear later on from Ayumi. And this is on monitoring displacement and disaster preparedness. There's the dynamic population mapping that could be used to complement population statistics and monitor public health, migration, which can be on domestic migration, seasonal workers, or cross-border commuting. There's also applications in tourism where we can see the movement of people either inbound, domestic, or outbound. We are also looking at transport and commuting statistics, where we are modeling, and this is an area that is still ongoing, where different types of informations are being explored in terms on how mobile phone big data can be used to complement transportation statistics. And lastly, the information society statistics, and this is where I'm coming from. There we are looking at how mobile phone data could be used to look at ICT indicators, particularly those that are included in the SDG, particularly on the number of people using the internet. So these are 6 areas, and one of them we will hear today from Ayumi. So the work that we are doing in these 6 broad areas, the main objective is to come up with a handbook in each of these areas, where we will be highlighting the applications, highlighting how data could be analyzed, and how to ensure quality and preparation of this data so that it can be used to complement traditional statistics. So the materials that we are preparing will be available shortly in the beginning of this year, and this will be made available to practitioners, particularly national statistical offices and anybody who's interested in using this type of data source. But while doing analysis on mobile phone data, it is important to note that we have to adhere as statisticians to the fundamental principles for official statistics. So this is a principles that we in the international statistical community, as well as in the national statistical offices are adhering to. And so with regards to the use of mobile phone big data, we put out 5 principles to ensure trust. And this is a paper that was published recently in the Data and Policy Journal, was presented in the October 2021 in Bern. And you have there the link. And the idea is to outline these 5 principles. And one of them is on necessity and proportionality. So it's important to note that we explore mobile phone data to fit a purpose. There should be a demand on why we are using this data. There should be also professional independence. So any political or any other forces that may influence the quality and the results should not be, I would say, entertained, because we have to ensure that the quality and impartiality of the data is there. We have to maintain privacy because mobile phone data is about data of individual, and this is one of the, I would say, the reasons why private companies are reluctant to share the data and where data protection agencies are coming in. So these principles is very important while analyzing mobile phone data. Commitment to quality, of course, is very important, and that is why we are preparing handbooks so that we are sure that the quality of the data that are coming from the mobile phone are ensured. And of course, international comparability. Since this will be at some point considered official statistics, we have to make sure that data that's coming out of this analysis can be compared at the international level. And it's also important to note that cooperation and sharing experiences at the international level is there, because this is a new area where others should learn from. So these are the 5 principles, and I invite you to look at this information from the link provided. So this is similar to what I mentioned earlier, and it is important to note that data protection is key in this area that we are working on with regards to mobile phone big data. And so it's important that local laws and anything that's relating to protection of privacy is adhered to. So this is the last slide. And just to say that the handbooks that we are preparing now, which will be published before the end of this quarter, will be available through trainings, which will be delivered to countries through the regional hubs and also through regional workshops. So with that, I would like to pass the floor to Ayumi. There are a lot more information in the link provided. This is where information that relates to the work of the task team is available. Thank you very much, and I'll be available for questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Esperanza. So, hi everyone. So today I will introduce Displacement Disaster Statistics Handbook. So first I will briefly introduce a subgroup and summary of the handbook and explain the use of displacement disaster statistics and the implementation through the use case of the Gambia. So our subgroup consists of many institutions, including the NGO, international organization, and academia. And we collect our use cases and summarize the commonality among the use cases as a key point for implementation in the handbook. So our group, displacement disaster statistics is not precisely official statistics, but we believe that this statistics is very important in disaster context because timely and quality information is necessary, and national statistical offices play important role in responding the data demand and disaster. And survey data alone may not be sufficient to inform response effort. So in our handbook, we discuss data characteristics. Mobile phone data we say here is a CDR data, call detail record. We discuss data characteristics to be considered in disaster context, such as selection biases, because the vulnerable are less likely to have cell phones compared to the wealthiest. But we also discuss that impact can be mitigated if penetration rate is high enough. And also we also discuss measurement bias because frequency of record affect how the data represent actual mobility pattern. But impact can be also reduced when studying long-term locations and mobility trend. And as Esperanza mentioned, we also discuss how we address the data privacy concern and protection measures. So data, including data, the identification, and also removing individually identifiable information, and also aggregation of small concept to be dropped. In the handbook, we summarize key steps taken to produce statistics. So it means it is not only the computing process for statistics, but also the institutional framework to have an agreement to use mobile phone data for producing this for public purposes, and also the data pipeline to be installed for processing CDR mobile phone data in the premise of data producer in each country, and also the data protection measure. And also the key step, also we summarize the statistical analysis process such as data quality assurance to make sure that the data is relevant for the purpose of the data analysis. And we highlight the two types of statistics, such as detecting displacement or relocation and measuring changes mobility level and result dissemination. As an example, as a country case one, we have a Haiti earthquake case in 2021. So as I mentioned, institutional framework and data pipeline is one of the unique aspects of displacement disaster statistics, because these factors help timely response under disaster, and also enhance the preparedness for future disaster. So the case of Haiti, there were long-standing relationship between Flowminder and this Haiti for the past earthquake and other health crises. So they use pre-existing data pipeline and also use FlowKit to rapidly produce initial mobility aggregates. And they anonymize data, and no personally identifiable information was included in their results. And they are complied with the EU GDPR. So data processed on the digital high premises. So in the handbook, we summarize the steps to be taken to detect the displacement as shown this slides. I don't go to detail. And this is an example of the displacement of the people at the administrative level. So this is aggregated statistics computed from CDR data. It shows the change in population count as a percentage of pre-earthquake period. The other country case is the COVID-19 in the Gambia. So there was also pre-existing partnership between National Statistical Office and PURA is a regulator, and World Bank and University of Tokyo for international migration analysis. So that was a engagement prior to the disaster. And once the COVID onset, analytical pipeline was already in place, and code was already there for computing some population statistics. So we employed a World Bank COVID-19 mobility indicator to compute the mobility statistics for understanding the changes to population mobility under COVID. So data are, again, also anonymized and aggregated, and a privacy preserving technique were reviewed based on the legal framework, and the data was promised on the regulator's promise in this case. Okay, I skipped the slides. Okay, sorry, I'll skip these slides. Then I'll explain how the implementation was adhered to the principle to ensure trust. So first, the necessity and the proportionality. So in the disaster context, the use of CDR data was fit for purpose, because the need was to understand the impact of COVID and enforcement measure. So the mobile phone data can create the quality and timely statistics. And we use indicator, which were sought to meet the demand of the National Statistical Office, and that these statistics were not computationally intensive. So it helped them to reduce response burden. And we used existing data pipeline and institutional framework. So it also helped to reduce our response burden for the national government. And second is the privacy protection. So data were aggregated and kept strictly confidential and used only for statistical purposes. And no individually identifiable information is included. And usually the privacy preserving technique were discussed by the data protection specific organization discussing data protection framework. But in the Gambia, we didn't have one. So we formed the a committee to discuss relevance in terms of the legal frameworks. And the third one is a commitment to quality. So the data quality, we have a rigorous process to assess the data quality, and also examining the relevance of the data for the analysis purposes. And also there is a limitation of the data. So these limitations were carefully examined when the results are interpreted. such as market share, geographic coverage, and correspondence with known population data, in addition to the biases and representativeness. In the Gambia, we use two data from two MNOs, and it allows us to use the data of the 70% of the market. We are aware that there are some overlaps between two MNO, but these two have a quite different population group as a main market. One is more for the popular in urban area with high-speed internet, and the other is more popular in rural area because they provide inexpensive plan, even though they only provide voice and SMS services. So in this case, we believe that it allow us to have more population, more coverage in terms of different population groups. And the professional independences. So methods were assessed according to the professional standard with the guidance of the National Statistical Office. And we try to ensure the transparency of the procedure by disclosing the process to compute these statistics to the public with documentation. And these are published to these are open to the public. And lastly, the international comparability. So data pipeline is based on an open source framework, and code is also open source and accessible on the GitHub. So it can be we try to maintain the transparency and reproducibility of the approach adopted, and it can be replicated in other countries. And as a result, results were used for informing policymakers and help communication, and prompted some discussions such as targeting testing initiative or addressing the adverse effect of lockdown or scaling up to provide real-time data. But there are some challenges and further discussions, such as establishing stronger relationship with potential end user, because it will help us to facilitate more effective dissemination of output. But under the disaster context, we did not have detailed discussion, so we computed a standardized indicator for that case. And securing data access remains still a challenge. So we need to discuss how we can analyze alternative data sources for such as the data available by the private sector. And CDR data is still sparse mobile phone data, and there are some challenges. So innovation in analytical method is still needed to improve the results. That's all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That was super interesting even for myself. Nice to meet you, everyone. I'm Rebecca Moreno. I'm the lead data scientist for UNHCR Innovation Service. And I'll speak to you a bit on how we work at operational level with CDR data. And this is the experience of our innovation team with many other field operations that we have. Let me just, 1 second, I'm gonna start sharing my screen on this one. Perfect. And then share. Great. I don't know if you are able to see that. That's it. So I'm going to be focusing specifically on forced displacement, which is getting into the news in Europe on what is forced displacement. It's not migration, it's when people are forced to flee the places of origin. And according to the convention, is precisely on a well-founded fear of persecution, or they're unable or unwilling to return to their home country because of fear. Their fears of being persecuted because of race, religion, belonging to a certain nationality, political opinion, and specifically members of a particular social group. And so this is also a case of prima facie refugees, which is our people where their countries at war. And so this is forced displacement, which is the difference within migration for those who are not very on the humanitarian law, which is we are all migrants. We're actually willing to migrate to another country, and this is not the case for refugees and asylum seekers and people in refugee-like situations. And so our job as UNHCR is to provide, as the UN agency, to provide and respond to the growing humanitarian needs that they have in the different contexts that they work. and you know, they have all sorts of needs, and this is what our protection mind lies about. So they have need for or the right to education in some places, the right to safe shelter, the right to water, even in some places there's no water. They have basic human rights that they need to be protected when they're fleeing into a new country, and this is where our colleagues on the ground actually are helping to ensure that they are safe whenever they're fleeing their homes. And part of our huge organization, which is composed of, I would say, 17,000 people around the world, 16,000 of them are in the field operations, and we got a bit of 1,000 in headquarters. It's an ongoing need because we have around 82 million people who live in forcibly displaced situation around the world right now. And so one of the things that we work, or at least the innovation service works, is that we help UNHCR colleagues to actually foster a culture of innovation, to provide innovation competency building from experimentation or budget or a lot of the process like innovation, but also make them aware of new tools, new partners that are working on challenges that they are of the competency that they do. So sometimes in the area of work of creating new shelters, creating new services, trying to, and one of the things that we were pretty like Yumi Esperanza were mentioning, trying to create new statistical capacity as well, and many other things that we work with. And we provide that space for them to be creative, allowing them to take a few risks, and now I was going to say very limited risks, because the type of work that we do could be very impactful and would say is life-saving sometimes. So we provide that space as innovation team, and we work very closely with them. And the way we do it specifically is through what we call having a human-centered approach. So we try to put refugees or asylum seekers or internally displaced people and stateless, which is part of our mind, like two people without nationality, here on the needs or whatever is the need that the community has at that specific moment. This is usually where the services surround them and the people that we work. And sometimes maybe the humanitarian challenge is how do we bring water to this place? How do we create schools for them? And or like how do we create information that can be life-saving at the moment? And in some cases, it could be that is related to a data problem. In the case of mobility, is how many people are fleeing, right? So it's usually the question. And where are they arriving? When are they expected to arrive? There's many other related when, how many related. And we don't do it alone. So this is a bit what we serve as innovation team. We were kind of like technical translation between a lot of our partners that are working in the case of data, computer scientists, data scientists, data engineers, postdoctoral researchers. And also sometimes we work with anthropologists, sociologists, and usually like for the field operations, which is these are UNHCR colleagues usually that are trying to provide these services, and they have a new idea of like, oh, by the way, I would like to explore these projects. So we actually kind of interact. It's like, oh, have you worked with them? It's like, no, but we know a partner that has done. And then there's a continuous feedback process in between all the new projects that we want to create. Just to say that everything here is based on field challenges and field operations. So our work is very demand driven. And this is the thing that we do is depending, we don't know where we're going to be working on. It's never top down. So whenever a field operation reaches out to us, we try to reach out to the network of humanitarian partners, of academic institutions, or other type of partners that have worked with the problem that the operation is giving us, because they usually come with like, I would love to work on this area, or I think we can calculate people arriving like this. And so sometimes the due diligence, and now we go about it for CDRs specifically in a bit, but then if there's no other person that has created that solution, then we help them to find the correct partners, or we help them themselves build the solution. And then, yeah, so it's kind of like an experimentation approach. And that doesn't mean that the experiment can scale or not, but like it could be that at some point it goes in a scalability process. And maybe another operation would like to copy with the approach and or the tool that they're using or not, or just lessons learned. And then we go into another space. And then, yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit on human mobility data. And this is the approach that we use for projects that are related to mobile data. Specifically CDRs, the call data records. And so this is very much our innovation process for UNHCR field colleagues. But so we just wanted to, no, there's someone in the way. We just wanted to share with you what we do with them, and maybe it will be useful for the projects that you're working with. And so it's a very local level. So first, they come to us with a very specific operational need. And usually it's like related to a challenge. So it could be what's the research question for data scientists, whoever is in the room for data science background. And for them, it could be something on how many people are going to arrive, or how many people are moving from this point to this point, or how many people are expected to be moving to this area of the country. And so that's the operational need, very specific for displacement again. And then sometimes the question would be, is it just a mobility project, or for displacements in this case, or is it more complex? Because if it's more complex, then you're just gonna resolve a tiny part, which is maybe how many people are moving, but then how to resolve the rest of the situation is like, how are you gonna provide services and all the humanitarian services that they need, that they need, that's another different question. But maybe sometimes it's just, let's start with the basics, which is how many people are gonna be moving. And then the second question that we ask them is like, can this challenge or can this question be addressed with the current UNHCR data collection mechanisms or methods that we have? So namely surveys, focus groups, home visits, like our team has foot on the ground. So they're like, you're there, so you collect data. And then sometimes the answer is no. Especially in humanitarian areas where we don't have what we call humanitarian access, so we don't have anyone there, and or we're not allowed to pass as UNHCR, and or we don't have any partners that can actually send us data. So this is where we resource on like, okay, let's organize or try to see if we can search for some data that is non-traditional, which is the case of CDRs. And then if not, then how else do they think that they can solve this challenge? And this is where it comes on like, okay, maybe CDRs are a solution. And that's the question. I went back one. And then that's the most important step actually for us and for operation is to understand the particular operational context. And we call operational context to the country and or region where refugees and or people that are fleeing, internally displaced people are being displaced. So the questions about that is on the situation we call country situation, guys, especially countries that are the country of origin of refugees. And the vulnerable groups, which in the case the refugees, it could be also internally displaced people, so they haven't crossed the border. What's the target population? Is it refugees? Then it's between two countries. Is it, or maybe three, if they have three borders. And if it's IDPs, then it's within a country, right? So depending on the target group, and that's the method of analysis. And then also it's like, is there any other way that you calculate mobility in this operational context? So it's like understanding also with the push and pull factors, what is making them flee. In some cases it's very obvious, Ukraine. In some other cases it's very complex, Venezuela. And so humanitarian crises are never the same, and the operational context is very important. And one of the things that you also see in crisis is that sometimes they have patterns and situations. So where were some of the patterns before? So in the case of Ukraine, I'm just going for Ukraine. Crimea can give you a bit of examples of what's happening right now, right? So maybe they have previous patterns and they will be able to calculate those patterns without using other non-traditional data sources. Maybe they just use border monitor people doing service in the monitor. So there's many other options now. And then the third question, which I think some people, when I was like, oh, let's use CDR, is like, hey, is there mobile penetration, number one, in the country? Because they might just hit the towers usually, which is what happens usually in war-zone countries. And then the second one is like, what are the main population communication channels, their preference, their habits? Do they normally like, and so what we ask them to do for the field operations is to do a communication and information needs assessment. So it's basically a survey asking refugees, how do they like to communicate? Do you use your phone? Yes. Do you use your phone in social media, in messaging apps, or in SMS, or in calls? Because that's also going to give you, so maybe they're saying social messaging apps or social networks, and that's completely different as I'm using SMS and calls, which is a bit of the concern of CDRs. So that's one. And then we help them to see, okay, say the refugees responded, yes, we use SMS and we use calls. That's for us is the cheapest option, or this is the safest option that we think, or that's the custom or the habit in the country. And so then the question is it appropriate for this operational context? If you could be doing more harm in humanitarian space than other things. And so the question is yes or no, well, then go to step 2, do your homework, understanding more the operational context. Maybe you need social network data. But if it's yes, then as the colleagues as Ayumi and Esperanza actually laid it better than me on this one, there's a lot of homework. On the policy level, which is understanding maybe the telecom country regulation in case you want to obtain the CDRs. You need to do risk assessment analysis to see if you're going to be harming more having that data than actually helping them. We have a lot of data protection related processes. I mean, remember, they're refugees, they're in fear. Sometimes of them, they're activists, they're human rights lawyers, they're opposition to the government. So having the data of these people actually, it could be very damaging to them, especially if this data were to be ever having a data breach, as ICRC about it. And then partnerships of, I don't know, like if you're gonna do a partnership with a service provider, naming maybe an MNO or any other service provider, then we have very strict due diligence on human rights violations, so avoiding to partner with companies or service providers that have human rights violations records, and then specifically setting up the memorandums of understanding, which is another legal process, and then additional ethical humanitarian considerations. So, and then at a technical level, then we always tell the operations, do not reinvent the wheel, do your homework. There's a lot of people that have worked on humanitarian, I would say mobility and forced displacement environments. And so I'm just mentioning here a few, UN Global Polls, specifically we work with FlowKit on anonymization using encryption techniques. So kudos to that one, GSMA, the EU Commission, Project Hidalgo has also a good paper, ACAPS, IOM, name it. Even the MNOs that have actually launched public challenge have very good record, which is Orange, D4D, and Tor Telecom, P4R. And then if nobody is working on that operational context, then you have a series of steps to do yourself. But if somebody else worked on this operational context or with these specific questions, then contact them because they might be able to work with you and explore potential area of collaborations. If not, then start getting your technical skills, which is your maybe after solving this and obtaining the data, which is very, very difficult legally, then you have technical work to do, which is aggregate the anonymized or the identify, sorry, and anonymize the data. In the cases it's applicable, sometimes the MNO will give it, like in the case of the challenges, anonymized, so that's great and simplified. But if not, then you need to establish the baseline, ensure the non-bias on the sampling, calculating the sampling, the calculation of the mobility patterns that you're studying, designing the model, validating, and then please publish your results because other organizations are looking for examples. And yeah, like, so working also on the technical limitations and some gaps that you have. This is what we, I wouldn't say not force, but actually encourage our field operations whenever they want us to work with them on CDR. That doesn't mean it looks impossible actually, but it's very doable in case actually it deems to be very appropriate, which is the case that we had at some point with Senegal. The first ever project that we established with UNHCR, it was actually not to have any, I would say, it was more a descriptive project. and it was also an experiment for us to actually see the way we did this diagram is precisely using Senegal example on having all the challenges that we have to have access to that data. And some of the quality of the data also could be low quality, so the low density data problem. And then also to identify the baseline, the hotspots, and some of the behaviors. And this is when we have the workaround. There's documentation on the chapter of mobile data analytics in refugee scenarios. And then the actual, or I would say the second experience that we work, it's Turkey urban areas, Syrian refugees living in Turkey via the Tor Telecom challenge. So here there was very specific on mobility patterns. In particular, the team in Turkey have this question of how are they segregating within the cities and urban areas specifically. And the data science question was how many people are segregated in X city. And so we have also a very particular operational context where Syrians do use SMS actually, and they call. And the SIM card registration, whenever you are registering for a SIM card in countries, so it's telecom regulation, they actually identify themselves as foreigners. They have a number, like a termination number. I think it's 999 or something like that in the CDRs. And so that means foreigner. It could be actually refugee or expat or whatever, but like in the case of Syrians, there was a certain proportion that we have as UNHCR that we know where they are. So it was just overlapping sampling methods, and they gave us the data set simplified now in that case. And then we started segregation, isolation, and homophilia. Homophilia is like if you have a community that is similar to you, usually you tend to live in that area. But we wanted to understand segregation precisely to see where we don't have UNHCR services, and we discover some very hot spots where they live and we don't have anyone to help. And so that was what we wanted to know. Where do we put the next, I don't know, hospital that is working with one of our partners? So if we're gonna build or actually ask to open a school at some point for refugees to be in, I don't know, the afternoon shift, can they put it like that? So it's very operational. And yeah, so that's a bit of how we work with this case. And as a final thing or recommendation to you guys that are working on this, or you're maybe interested in applying CDRs or other mobility, the non-traditional mobility data sets, is to always have a team of very diverse teams of designers, because you might have skip or you might do some assumptions in the work or in the design of the work, or you might just want to jump into the solution. And especially when you have a so present situation, which is for displacement, you just want to help, but sometimes you could be doing more harm. So it's very good to stop, to pause and reflect and see if that is actually useful, because you're going to embark in a whole process that is going to be convoluted, but at the end it will be useful. And then, yeah, like just going on ongoing adaptation, revise your metrics, ask always questions, and see your own bias, especially on the collection and the sampling. And this is what we recommend, not only for CDRs, but for any data related or technology related solutions for humanitarian settings. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right, thank you so much, Rebecca and Ayumi and Esperanza. I think that was really an outstanding overview of a lot of the current issues involved in, both the role of official statistics and the role of humanitarian agencies in incorporating mobility data into a number of the different workflows. Do we want to bring Esperanza and Ayumi's video back? We have a few questions to start off with. We have about 15 minutes. I would encourage folks to put anything that you'd like to park in the chat, and we can come back to it. I'd like to start off with the question from Ben Grubb. And if Ben, you'd like to come off mute and ask it directly, we can kind of build you into the conversation, but specifically about the task team itself and access to data. Oh, there he is. Hi, Ben.
Hi, folks. Sorry, it's a bit late here in Bangkok, but appreciate the presentation, folks. I had a pretty simple question to kick things off. As a UN agency, kind of interested to get on board with the working group on mobile data, what are the options? How can we get involved, join, and ultimately get access to some of the data sets? Over.
Andrew, maybe I can take that question. Yes, so the task team on mobile phone data is open to international agencies and countries working on big data. So particularly on the mobile phone data, what I can do is to get in touch with you and share my coordinate. And then you can let us know in terms of your interest, and we can invite you to a meeting that we are having once a month and see whether this will serve the purpose that you are looking for. Second, in terms of the data itself, so the data itself are still residing in countries. So mobile phone data usually doesn't leave the national boundaries, and this is one of the limitations of this data set. So there are several projects that are ongoing in different areas, and what we do is to get access to those data is either work through the task team and the different stakeholders that we are working with. And because, when you have access to the data, it's not limited only to one type of statistics. You can use it for multiple purposes. And the 6 areas that I showed you is, some examples of applications where mobile phone data can be used. So this is one way of getting access to the data by working together with other experts in this area. Thank you.
Terrific. I want to pick up on that question of data access. I actually posed this in the chat as well, but and maybe all of you can can address it. I know Ayumi, you started to, but particularly for CDR data, as you mentioned, this is doesn't leave the boundaries of the national borders, and is often very difficult to access quickly. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about both sort of the process of data agreements as you've kind of developed, as you've seen them, and maybe the scope, and then specifically disaster-based CDR agreements and how that, you know, sort of is developed ad hoc as needed, you know, in various circumstances. Ayumi, if you want to take that first, maybe. And
thank you. I think in our country cases we introduced, we already have existing framework. So we have general agreement on how we access the data for addressing their problem in each country. And once a disaster occurred, in terms of the Gambia, we have a discussion to, reorient the use of the mobile phone data for other purposes. And we try to have a kind of agreement, internal agreement, to see whether it is relevant in terms of the pre-existing framework and the new framework we want to bring in for disaster context. And usually under disaster context, because it fits for the purpose, so we did not revise the agreement, pre-existing agreement. So in the case of the Gambia, we use existing framework. So we didn't have any specific new agreement for disaster context, but national government agency are flexible in terms of the useful because of necessity. So we have if you have a pre-existing agreement or any framework, it is easier to, flexibly utilize that framework. Yes.
Right. So you're saying basically like that in the case of government agencies, you would have a standing agreement that could be adapted for disaster. If there is no standing agreement, then what happens?
I think it.
Sorry. No, I was gonna say that in our case, you use brokers. We have used GSMA as brokers, and this is, but maybe as you mean, like on agreements, we don't need them a year into the thing, and a year maybe the crisis is over, and utilize brokers. But I don't know. I'm sorry, Jimmy, I interrupted you.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that. So now wearing my international telecommunication hat, so we did a number of pilots in several countries using mobile phone data because we want to explore in different regions of the world how we can use this for complementing our traditional statistics. And in that pilot, what we did is to put together the different stakeholders. So we started contacting the ministry and asked the ministry to put together a framework, like a stakeholder meeting, where they put together the National Statistics Office, the Data Protection Agency, and the operators themselves. The regulator, of course, is very important because they work directly with the mobile operators. And through that kickoff meeting, we had to explain to them the context of the work and why we need to access mobile phone data. And people get excited and they were able to get access to the data. But then during the implementation, this is where it gets a bit challenging because there has to be non-disclosure agreements or agreements to share the data, and the Data Protection Agency will also come in to make sure that privacy is preserved. So my point here is it's important to get national coordination. If you are going to start a process like this, it's important to involve the different stakeholders so that commitments are there and that there will be accountability at the end of the process. Thank you.
Got it. All right. Thank you. I wanted to maybe kind of pick up on this, again, the question around data usage and agreements, and Ben's question as well to Rebecca, where, how would you compare your kind of engagements with CDR providers to some of the other, more app-based or advertising-based data brokers like Cubic, Meta Data for Good, or Data for Good at Meta, sorry, and some of these others? Where have you seen kind of strengths, weaknesses, advantages, both in terms of analysis and in terms of agreements?
Yeah, as I was saying, it depends on the operational context. So Meta has been very useful for Venezuela, even though that is painful to work knowing Bangladesh context. But it's very, very useful for Venezuela. Venezuela mobile and the internet penetration is above 70%. And whenever we have conducted communications and it needs assessment on communication channels, they always mention that they use Meta's main messaging app, which is WhatsApp. And so that's the main communication channel. So any other maybe is complementary to their main communication channel. So refugees are using WhatsApp and that's their main communication channel. And Meta social media maybe less. And that's why it's important to understand, and that's useful. Still, all the, I would say, data sharing agreements or service providers agreement in this case is a mix weird in between these two, because it's not data sharing, it's more the service provision as part of the data for good initiative for Meta. But in the case of GSMA, for example, they have been very, very, I would say, collaborative whenever we needed specific data on an ongoing or a sudden onset situation. And because there's a consortium of MNOs that they, I would say, trust GSMA as broker, and they trust that they're not going to break, even in the meetings, because we're with the advisory board, they would always say, like, I know that you're now on their oath, basically, on like you're nothing that is going to be shared in this meeting is going to be like put forward, because it could be even serving as intelligence. We know that this data is also for competitiveness for MNOs. If someone has the access of the other, then there's an issue on competitiveness there. So what they do is they send it to the broker kind of aggregates. A lot of work for the broker as well, but at least that's how you do it. But if not, then that's I think on the regulation, I would not even there. I would defer to ITU and telecom regulation if you want to establish a national one. But yeah, it depends. So I don't think it's one is more useful than the other. I think it's you need to human center it again, right? To ask your population that you're trying to analyze or the mobility pattern. And so in our case, it's refugees, but maybe in your case, it's a natural disaster population, or it could be someone else. Then ask them, do you actually use your phone? And what do you use it for? How do you use it? Because then CDR data is not useful. It's something else, right? But it's cumbersome. So just to respond very quickly to Ben, very cumbersome to establish service provision agreements and data sharing agreements, and or in this case, I would say, yeah, like CDR sharing, because that's they need to, especially for CDRs, they need to do extra anonymization. In the case of Meta, they already had it embedded on the platform, so it's very aggregated, anonymized. The Meta platform, so it's just about like numbers on, it's not mobility, it's more COVID-19, but there's a few mobility patterns. So yeah, it's advantages and disadvantages are depending on your population, I have to say.
Got it, thank you. I wanted to call on Anupuri really quick, put comment in here about vulnerability, marginal communities, and you know, sort of the issues about data protection as well as access. And I think this echoes Shenyu's question from earlier about how, say, variation in kind of mobile phone usage and ownership rates affects some of the statistics being calculated and how you're kind of thinking about that. But both from the data protection side, so not just individual privacy, but also community protection, and then in terms of representativeness of the statistics, how do you kind of think that through?
Thank you so much. And exactly that was my intent, that most of our programming work, you know, like we are all from, most of us are from UN organizations, and we try to reach out to the most vulnerable, and most of the digital channels, they have limitations in accessing those population sets. So just wanted to know from Rebecca, what are your thoughts on reaching out to those populations? Like, have you ever used a mix of different data channels or digital channels to reach out to the larger population sets, like a mix of mobile technologies and digital channels, etc.? How have you reach the large population sets? Because that is what we need to do, you know, like, and that is where our programming intent is. So just wanted your reflections on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anu. I have to confess that I belong to the data team in innovation, but we have a very specialized team on digital inclusion, and they also work, and we work closely with them in some cases. And when I mentioned the communications and information needs assessment, they are the ones designing the assessment. I'll put the links on the chat. There are certainly some populations that are obviously underrepresented, and they don't have access to mobile phone. This is the case of many countries, especially women and children. And these are the most vulnerable, usually also in displacement crisis. And so that's where I was telling you, there's other humanitarian and ethical considerations that maybe, and I was talking about CDR, but we do have a lot of guidance notes on how to reach out to other non-connected populations, which you need to use I would say, traditional qualitative methods of research. So boots on the ground with protection monitoring, in our case, with surveys, focus groups, home visits, name it, on whatever has contact with them. There is sometimes, in some cases, there's a mix, depending also on data literacy. So in the case of Venezuela, they usually don't have access to data until they arrive to the other border, and then they are like super savvy. And so at the beginning, they're just finding just electricity. And then I was just thinking of when I met in Lesbos, and Lesbos situation was kind of similar. As soon as they just got electricity, they're super uber connected. So it depends on the country of origin. It depends on the socioeconomic background. It depends on the nationality. Depends on many things. But I can gladly share some guidance for those non-connected population. Also, tiers of refusal. So I'm just gonna get into human rights right now. For those who have disabilities, that's also very difficult because they're not able to use a mobile phone just because they have certain disabilities, especially the ones on sight and ear.
Thank you so much. I just have a follow-up question for both of you. Like, is it possible that we can bring Meta team on board and work together with them to innovate for these unconnected populations? Because ultimately, what is our common good goal, and if they are ready to come down and work with us and innovate with us, that would work better for us rather than using the technologies that they have to offer. Just a thought for you and and your reflections. Thank you.
Andrew, I wouldn't dare to comment on behalf of the Meta team, but maybe you have more contact with them.
I wouldn't comment on their behalf either, but I do think I know it's a really good idea. And so, and you're probably in contact with all the various folks, but if it's helpful to connect any dots, we'd be happy to help.
So I'm not in touch with them, but I'm just thinking loud with you because
Sure.
In humanitarian context, we have so much of needs like that, and hearing Becca and hearing Esperanza, so like we can bring together a team who may have ear to it, and they may come together with us to look for the common good in that sense. Over.
Yeah, absolutely. I can circle back with you directly on that, so we can connect up those dots. And then Esperanza and Ayumi, did you want to comment on integration of some of these other? I know you're focused principally on CDR, but there is this whole other field around this more app-based data. How does that integrate with what you're doing?
Yeah, well, at least on the task team, we are not just limited to CDRs. We are also looking at passive positioning and any other positioning type of data. So in a way, we are trying to capture, even though they are not used for building purposes. So whatever the mobile phone could capture, we are also trying to explore that. And in terms of, having Meta being part of, like, for example, the task team, we are, as I said, open to private and international countries and think tanks to be part of the task team. And I think in the past, there was some reach out that was already done to get hold of Facebook at that time. But I think this is something that we can, again, I don't want to speak on behalf of the whole UN CEBD team, but I think this is a great opportunity, again, to reopen the discussion and see how we can get access to those data. Of course, there's the metadata for good, where they have this relative wealth index information, and some of those information are already sort of like, it's not microdata, but it's more like aggregated at some, levels geographically that could be maybe explored. And that is something that also we want to see how we can make use of. But that is really a great suggestion. Thank you.
Right. Terrific. Well, I want to just acknowledge that we're at time, and to thank all of our speakers for your outstanding presentations. I think there's a number of links that are in the chat. We will also circulate those links in a follow-up later. This video will be available shortly, and we will be sure to reach out to everyone with the other additional materials. And the next meeting of this particular group will be at the end of March, where we will be focusing on the publication of the white paper on mobility data and health emergencies from the Harvard Radcliffe seminars that occurred in March and April of last year. So we will be back in touch shortly with all of that. And thank you very much for your participation. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mm.